Hey guys, welcome to another video on the wheelbase topic, and that topic is actually going to be expanded to a couple other things. I decided to make a bunch of videos about this because otherwise all the information gets compacted into one video. There's already a lot of videos on the internet that are just touching the subject or kind of like looking into a couple things but not really digging deep into the geometry and the different chassis for drifting. I want to change that, so I want to make a little more in-depth videos. So it's going to be a bunch of them, otherwise we're going to end up with a 2-hour video. Nobody's going to watch that, and it's going to become way too technical and way too detailed real quick. Somebody replied on the first wheelbase video, hey, this is only half the information because it also matters how wide the car is, and that is absolutely true. The reason why that wasn't incorporated in the first video is exactly because of what I just said. Otherwise the videos would just become way too long. So the third video on this topic, we're also going to be looking at how wide the cars are, but obviously everybody has a different angle kit, different wheels, different tires, all kinds of differences between these cars, so we need to have a certain benchmark. Of course, I like to run the cars on Wisefab suspension. It's the leading angle kit at the moment. So let's have a look at what all these cars are regarding their width if we run a Wisefab kit on them, and if we run the same wheel, an 8J ET35. Of course, this video is going to show you a couple things, and you can play around with the tire width and the wheel offset and all these kinds of things. But we're just going to benchmark on an 8J 235 tire with ET35. First, we're going to be looking at the Nissans. The very popular S13, we established it has a wheelbase of 97 inches, which isn't really a long wheelbase, the shortest wheelbase of the S chassis. If we put a Wisefab kit on there with an 8J ET35 wheel, we're going to end up with a width of 74 inches. Now, what we're going to be doing in this video, we're going to be taking the width of the car and we're going to be taking the wheelbase of the car, and we're going to basically come up with a number that combines those two together, and let's call that the wheelbase ratio. And we're going to do that by taking the 97 inches of wheelbase and dividing that by the 74 inches of width, and there's going to be a number from there. It's going to be higher or lower, and it's going to give you the ratio of how wide the car is compared to the wheelbase. And in the case of the S13, that's going to be 97 divided by 74, which is 1.31. So that's a ratio of 1.31. If you look at the S14, S15, that's 99 inches, a little over 99 inches wheelbase. With the Wisefab kit, it would also be 74 inches, and that would give you a ratio of 1.33. So S13, 1.31. S14, S15, 1.33. If you look at a 350Z, that's a longer wheelbase, 104 inches, so that's almost 5 inches longer than an S14, S15. With the Wisefab kit and that set tire, that's going to be 76 inches wide, and that gives you a ratio of 1.36. The 370Z, one of the most interesting things is 370Z is a lot shorter wheelbase, more like S14 wheelbase, but it has the same width as the 350Z, with the same angle kit and wheel, which gives it a ratio of 1.31, which is the same as an S13. Very interesting there. So the 370Z has a little bit longer wheelbase than the S13, but because it's a little bit wider, it gives you the same number of 1.31 for the wheelbase ratio. The G35, 112 inches, one of the longest wheelbases of all the cars on our list. It has the same kit as a 350Z, or if you have a 337 G37, it's going to be the same width as a 370Z, which gives you a ratio of 1.47 for the Nissan. So if you look at the Nissans, 1.31 is the shortest wheelbase ratio for both the S13 and the 370Z. Then we get the S14, 1.33, 350Z 1.36, G35 1.47. And again, I'm not saying that one thing is better or worse or whatever. We're just making a list over here, and we're adding another element to that list, so we end up with a number that we can work with. And you're going to see a couple surprises in this list, but that's it for the Nissans. Of course, another popular drifting chassis is going to be the BMWs, and we established a couple things over there as well. We start with the E30, 101 inches wheelbase with the Wisefab kit. That's 73 inches wide, which gives you a ratio of 1.38. E36, 106 inches wheelbase, 74 inches wide, gives it a ratio of 1.43, which is a pretty high ratio, as you can tell. E46, an inch longer wheelbase than the E36, same width on the angle kit, a 1.44 ratio for the E46. Wisefab also makes the narrow kits now, which I'm really happy with, because a lot of these cars with a little bit lower power, you don't want to make the rear really wide. Also for a sedan, there's not a lot of good wide body rears, but that means that you don't really want to make the rear like too wide, because you don't want to fit like crazy big tires on there. So it's nice that you now have the narrow kit for if you want to keep the car narrower, or if you want to run a wide body kit but you want to run like an ET0 or ET5 tire to have a lot more jacking or whatever you want to do. So it just gives you a little bit more options. If you look at the narrow kit on the E36, that will give you a wheelbase ratio of 1.48. So that's a 0.5 difference with the 1.43 wheelbase ratio with the normal Wisefab kit. And on the E46, you're going to go from a 1.44 wheelbase ratio to a 1.49 wheelbase ratio with the Wisefab narrow kit. So again, 0.5 difference there. E90 is on 108 inches, but it's 75 inches wide with the Wisefab kit, which gives it the exact same wheelbase ratio as an E46 on 1.44. So that's interesting. Obviously, the wheelbase is longer, but the car is also wider, so the ratio is the same on the E90 and on the E46. If you look at the F30, F80, Jordan's car, 110 inches wheelbase, and also Duarte's car, obviously, Taylor Ray. Jordan kind of like started a thing with that. Great that these guys are driving these cars. 110 inches. With Wisefab, it's 78 inches wide, which gives it a ratio of 1.41. So the ratio is actually less than an E36, even less than an E46, even less than an E36. Really interesting. The F22 on 105 inches, 5 inches shorter wheelbase than the F30. Same kit, so it's going to be on 78 inches, which gives it a ratio of 1.34. So if you look at the BMWs, the shortest wheelbase ratio is actually the F22 on Wisefab with 1.34. Then we get the E30, 1.38, F30 and F80, 1.41. E36 1.43, and the E46 and the E90 are both on 1.44. So that's kind of a shakeup. Really interesting that we're doing this. Next thing we're looking at is the Corvettes, the C5, 104 inches wheelbase, so not the shortest wheelbase, but the angle kit is pretty wide, 79.5 inches, which gives it a ratio of 1.30. Pretty short ratio over there. It's more in the shorter in the S chassis territory over there. Obviously, a lot of people ask things like, "Oh, why is the Wisefab kit so wide?" It's not because we get a kick out of making wide kits. We just look at a certain tire size that people run, and we want to make that wheel with that tire do 65 to 70 degrees and like all your suspension working and everything. And that's basically one of the parameters how the width of the lock-kit gets established. There's also a couple other things into play. Obviously, I'm not disclosing everything, but like it's not like we make a kit really wide for fun if the car has wide frame rails, like a Corvette has really big beefy frame rails, but also a GT86 has pretty wide frame rails because of the boxer engine. The control arms just need to have a certain length, otherwise that wheel's not going to do 65 degrees, simple as that, or you need to run a 205 15-inch wheel, which nobody does on these pro cars. So that's just how it works. Like every angle kit is only as wide as it needs to be. On the Corvette, it needs to be 79.5 inches, and it gives you a ratio of 1.3. On the C6, 105 inches wheelbase, 79.5 inches wide with that same ET35 8J tire up front, gives you a 1.32 ratio, which is shorter than any of the BMWs. So despite the fact that the wheelbase of the Corvettes is very similar to an E36, a little bit shorter than E36, it's almost 10 points difference in the wheelbase ratio. So the E36 is 1.43 and the C6 is 1.32 wheelbase ratio difference. Wisefab also makes a narrow kit for the Corvettes, so you have a little less angle obviously, but you don't have to fit a wide body or whatever. If you run that with the same tire on the C5, you go from a 1.30 wheelbase ratio to 1.38. That's the OEM arms with the Wisefab knuckle. And on the C6, you can already guess, you go from 1.32 to 1.4. So that's a 0.8 difference. So 1.4. So the Wisefab C6, as my drift week car is on a shorter wheelbase ratio than an E46 with the Pro kit. So my Wisefab equipped E46 M3 is a 1.44 ratio, and my OEM arms Wisefab Knuckle C6 is 1.40. Very interesting because cars are very similar wheelbase. So that's like a really interesting thing going on over there. The Corvette's 1.3, 1.32 on the Wisefab Pro kit. Let's have a look at the Toyotas, the GT86 GR86, which is 101 inches wheelbase with a Wisefab width of 75 inches. Puts that car on 1.34 wheelbase ratio. Interesting over there. So that's kind of like in the middle, 1.34. You're going to be seeing that a lot of these cars with the shorter wheelbase, they're going to be under 1.3. And the cars with the longer wheelbase are going to be over 1.38. So 1.34 for the GT86 GR86 is kind of smack down in the middle. Supra MK4, as we established, that car has a super short wheelbase for such a big car, or for such like full-size sports car. With the Wisefab kit, it's on 77 inches, giving it a very short wheelbase ratio of 1.27, which is a lot shorter than the kit for the S chassis. Obviously, the wheelbase is one thing, but the angle kit's also wider, making that car on a pretty short wheelbase ratio, 1.27. Then the big surprise of the wheelbase video, Supra MK5, 97 inches, even a shorter wheelbase than the Supra MK4 and a much shorter wheelbase, 4 inches shorter than the Toyota GR86. Crazy. Both are sports cars, both are Toyotas, 4 inches difference in there. That's on 79 inches, pretty wide. It's almost as wide as a Corvette angle kit on the Supra MK5. Gives it one of the shortest ratios in this video, 1.22. So Supra MK4, 1.27. Supra MK5, 1.22. We're looking at the Chaser, which is going to be 77 inches wide on the Wisefab kit with the tire we've been putting on every car virtually, 1.38. Then the Lexus or the Toyota Altezza Lexus IS300, that's on 110 inches wheelbase. Pretty long wheelbase, same as an F30, but 76 inches wide on the Wisefab kit, narrower than the newer body BMWs, giving it a ratio of 1.44, so pretty long ratio there for the IS300. The Toyota Soarer is going to be on a 1.36 ratio. If we're looking at the Mustang boys, S550, we don't make an angle kit yet for the S550. It is in development, so please stay tight and purchase that kit as soon as it comes out. Obviously, follow all my channels for all the updates on that. S550 Mustang, 107 inches wheelbase. We are not sure how wide the Wisefab kit's going to be. So if I look at the width that the car has from the factory and I compare that to other cars, we kind of get to 77 inches width on that car. That's kind of like expected. Could also be 78, obviously, 79. We don't know. We'll know when that kit is fully developed. But let's run with 77 inches at the moment, which would give it a ratio of 1.38. The Fox Body Mustang, 7 inches shorter wheelbase than the S550 on 100 inches. But again, calculating back, there is no Wisefab kit for it. But if I look at how wide the car is, and it's like comparable to an E30, for instance, even a little less wide than an E30. And we look at how, I would say that car probably 72, 73 inches wide on Wisefab, which would give it the exact same ratio as the S550, also 1.38. The Mustang 197, same method. It would be, if there was a Wisefab kit for it, it would be 75 inches wide, which is right in between a Fox body width and a Mustang S550 width, which would give it a ratio of 1.42. Then we're taking a look at the Mazdas, the Miata. We don't make a kit for it. Again, sorry, Miata guys, love Miatas, no hate there. 89 inches wheelbase, and it would probably be, calculating back, 73 inches wide with a Wisefab kit, because this car, if I just look at the suspension concept on that and I compare that to the other cars where we have similar suspension concepts on, how much wider they got, and like I basically had to guesstimate a little bit. So I think it would be 73 inches wide with the Wisefab kit, which would give it a ratio of 1.21, which is a really short wheelbase ratio, but it's the same as the Supra MK5. So the Mazda Miata, if there was a Wisefab kit for it, would be the same, expected to be the same wheelbase ratio as the Supra MK5. The FD Mazda RX-7, 95 inches, very short wheelbase. The Wisefab width on that car, because we do have a kit for it, is 77 inches, which gives it a ratio of 1.23. So the FD-RX-7 is almost the same ratio as a Supra MK5 over there. Really interesting stuff. So what are the weird things that we're looking at in this list? Obviously, we can look at what are the shortest wheelbases and all that stuff, and longest wheelbase that which we already did in the first video. If you look at weird cars that have the same wheelbase ratio, the 1.31 ratio of the S13 is very similar to the 1.30 ratio of the Corvette C5, and the C6 wheelbase ratio is right in between the S13 and S14, S15. Very, very interesting there. The BMWs are pretty long wheelbase, and they're not crazy wide. They're a lot less, or they're almost 4 inches less wide than a Corvette and Wisefab, which makes sure that they have a pretty high wheelbase ratio, 1.43, 1.44, where the E90 has the same wheelbase ratio as an E46, despite having a 2 inches longer, almost 2 inches longer wheelbase. There are not a lot of other really big surprises. It's kind of interesting that the Toyota Supras are on a much shorter wheelbase ratio than the S14s. The 350Z and 370Z seem to be kind of in the middle over there, which is kind of good. With the 370Z, obviously 1.36, so that's like kind of like a medium. There's not a lot of cars on 1.36. Yes, that's kind of interesting. Let's look at the lists. Let's compare these lists to one another. Now let's have a look at this list over here that we ended up having, which is the wheelbase ratio list. We're going to be comparing that to the wheelbase list that we made in the first video. First, the Miata NB, no surprise there, 1.21 wheelbase ratio. Supra MK5, 1.22 wheelbase ratio, very short. RX-7 FD, 1.23 wheelbase ratio there. Supra MK4, 1.27. And now it's getting interesting. The Corvette C5, 1.30 wheelbase ratio. So what we're seeing is that there are cars that came up pretty high on the wheelbase list because they have a reasonably long wheelbase, obviously. But they are pretty wide, which makes the wheelbase ratio actually pretty short, like the case of the Corvette C5, 1.30. So the S13 has a longer wheelbase ratio than a Corvette C5 on 1.31, which is the same as a 370Z. The Corvette C6 is on 1.32. It's interesting. My buddy Chris Finch from Vegas has both the Corvette C6 and the 370Z doing drift weeks with those cars. And they're virtually the same wheelbase ratio, 1.31 versus 1.32. S chassis, S14, S15, 1.33. So the popular S14, S15 has a longer wheelbase ratio than both the Corvette C5 and the Corvette C6. Interesting there. GT86, GR86, 1.34 wheelbase ratio, which is the same as an F22 BMW, which is also the shortest BMW in this list, the F22. No car has a lower wheelbase ratio than that car. The Soar is on 1.36, which is the same as the 350Z, and this is like kind of interesting because everybody would say, oh, the Soar is much longer wheelbase, it's a bigger car than 350Z, you can really tell. Same wheelbase ratio as a 350Z if you put both cars on Wisefab. And an E30, the little E30 is actually on a higher wheelbase ratio than a 350Z, than an S14, than a Corvette C6, a 370, a Supra MK4. All these cars are on a shorter wheelbase ratio than the tiny E30. Mustang S550 is the same wheelbase ratio as an E30. Interesting there. The Mustang Fox body is the same wheelbase ratio as a Mustang S550. It's only 100 inches wheelbase, but it's less wide. So you end up in that same category, 1.38, which is the same as a Toyota Chaser. So the Chaser, 1.38. And we've seen that the Toyota Chaser is very similar to the BMW E36, E46 wheelbase. But it's a way shorter wheelbase ratio if you put both cars on Wisefab. F30 BMW, 1.41. Mustang S197, 1.42. The BMW E36, 1.43, E46, 1.44, and E90 is also on 1.44 wheelbase ratio. So it's very, very interesting that F22 is 10 points difference in wheelbase ratio than an E46. Pretty crazy over there if you think about it. Then we're looking at the Altezza Lexus IS300 1.44 wheelbase ratio, and G35, G37 is on 1.47. Then we go to the alternative Wisefab kits, the Corvette C5 on the OEM arms, which is 1.38 wheelbase ratio. And Corvette C6 on the OEM Wisefab are on the OEM arms with Wisefab knuckle is 1.4. The narrow E36 kit 1.48, and the narrow E46 kit 1.49. It's pretty interesting stuff over there. So now let's compare these two lists. Let's compare the list from the first video and the list from this video, and then we see on the top 3 spots nothing really changed. The same top 3 cars there with the shortest wheelbase also have the shortest wheelbase ratio. One of the biggest differences here is going to be the Corvette C5, as you guys see, which is midway down the list of the wheelbase, but it's actually the 5th car here on the wheelbase ratio. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Another thing that's really funny is that obviously the S14, S15, that's one of those cars that a lot of people would say, oh, they have such a short wheelbase, this and that, and then it's the wheelbase ratio of it is higher than their Corvette C6, which a lot of people always tell me like, oh, how do you like the Corvette with such a long wheelbase, this and that, but like with Wisefab, it's actually a lot shorter wheelbase ratio than you would think. BMW is pretty far down the list, although they are about like 3/4 down the list of the wheelbase. They're at the bottom of the list over there, 1.43, 1.44 ratios. Super interesting. E30, also one of those cars, like who would expect an E30 has the same wheelbase ratio as a Mustang S550, and that the Mustang S550 has the same wheelbase ratio as a Fox body Mustang. So I really like these kind of things. Obviously it doesn't say everything. Like I said in the first video, a lot of it also has to do with a center of gravity, all kinds of other small differences that these chassis may have. And of course you can play around with this. So if you would go to a wider wheel or higher or a lower offset wheel, you can kind of like play around with that. So let's say that you have a F22, you can probably get that to a Corvette C6 or a 370Z wheelbase ratio. And another thing, obviously, what does it really mean? That's what we're going to be looking at in the next video. After this is going to be the final video. We're going to be looking at things like forward bite, side bite, and like how this wheelbase really affects the driving, because we can see like the Supra MK5, which is on the super short wheelbase ratio, is a car that does really well in FD. Frederick Asbo took it to the podium, but then Rome also took it to the podium with a 1.43 E36. So there's a lot there. Definitely affects like how the car drives and how it feels, but it's all in correlation with all the other parameters you put in the car, and also obviously driver preference. Thank you guys for watching the video, and of course keep in mind that we can supply you with all these parts. As I said, the channel really isn't monetizing much, so I just make these videos as a labor of love. This stuff is in my head like 24/7 for the past 15 years or something, so it's just nice to share it finally with you guys. There's a lot of stuff that I think about, calculate, and look at. But yeah, no, definitely cool. Thank you guys for checking out the channel. Obviously check out our website. If you need any parts, I'll hook you up with obviously Wisefab Feal Suspension, but also Fuel Lab, ASD handbrakes, a bunch of other brands that we're representing in Europe and in America. So hit me up. I hope you guys have a great day. I always love reading the comments, so thank you so much.